This YouTube series is made possible by the generous contribution of Insiders Plus members like you. If you're not a member and you'd like to become one, just go to smartrecovery.org/insiders. Thank you.
Welcome to First Look. I'm your host, Luke Frazier. Today on the program, we're going to speak with David Koss. He's a board member of Smart Recovery and the Director of Government Relations. Welcome to the program, Dave.
Hi, Luke.
So let's start right with what your title means. For folks who may not be familiar with legislative concerns or things in that kind of world, what does the Director of Government Relations do?
National organizations, nonprofits, for-profits, listeners and viewers know Smart Recovery is a national nonprofit, are affected by what happens, what the state and local and federal government does. And almost all of them have someone who keeps track of what the federal government does as it relates to their organization. So I do that for Smart Recovery, and being based in the Washington, D.C. area, I spent a lot of time as a congressional staffer back in the day and doing government relations work as part of my day job as an attorney. I promote Smart Recovery to federal agencies, congressional staff, senators, members of the House of Representatives, and advocate positions on a wide range of issues that are beneficial to people who are suffering from substance use disorders, which is what Smart Recovery is there for.
Yeah. And so on that topic of substance use disorders, I imagine there's a lot going on Capitol Hill, probably throughout the U.S. at state capitals. But what are the first kind of couple things that come to mind when it comes to things that are happening legislatively or regulatory with substance use disorders?
What I need to do, what the board Smart Recovery needs to do and does, is what the firm that we've contracted with to follow action in state capitals does, is keep in mind the late Hubert Humphrey's comment that the moral test of government is how it treats those who are in the dawn of life, the children, those who are in the twilight of life, the elderly, and those who are in the shadows of life, the sick, the needy, and the handicapped. So we focus on those members of Congress that keep Vice President Humphrey's concerns to heart, not those that think Hunter Biden invented COVID or that the election in 2020 was fraudulent or that the dictator in Hungary is a good guy. Not those members of Congress.
Not them. I got you.
Not them on the board, yes. But if we focus on those members of Congress in both parties, Roy Blunt in Missouri, who's retiring, Rob Portman in Ohio, who's retiring, unfortunately, and a whole lot of congressmen, men and women who are not, who care about and follow Humphrey's slogan. They're working very hard in Washington, and you're right, Luke, they have counterparts in some of the states. But in Washington right now, there's two things going on. One is the relevant committees that write bills, authorization bills, the substantive laws, the Energy and Commerce Committee in the House, the bill that reported out Obamacare years ago that deals with automobile safety issues, Medicare Part D, for those of you that remember that, or for older people who need that coverage. That committee in the House reported out a major bill reauthorizing and expanding federal programs that provide treatment and care for people with substance use disorders and mental health.
As Humphrey said, those are folks who need the kind of consideration and the kind of, assistance that people of goodwill can offer.
Right. And that bill was passed by the House. The House version was passed by the House within the past week, HR7666, and it includes a lot of smaller bills that I'm not going to bore you with, and sort of knitted together to a big, multi-hundred page package. And the Senate Committee on Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions, the committee that Ted Kennedy used to be chairman of famously, chaired now by Patty Murray of Washington State, is working on its own version. And there's no law, so to speak. There's nothing in the Constitution that requires those two bills to be knitted together and passed before Congress goes home for the election. But there's a lot of hope that that bill will be negotiated out and maybe Christmas Eve or New Year's Eve make it to the president. Also, every year the budget has to be funded. The federal budget has to be funded, and the bill that funds the federal government for the federal fiscal year that begins this October also includes money for the Department of Health and Human Services, which means it includes money for the agency whose nickname is SAMHSA, and the one HRSA, and those agencies within HHS also provide money for people with substance use disorders. And within the weeds of that is money, in theory, for peer support, for self-empowering group support meetings, such as Smart Recovery. But not just Smart Recovery, it would be other similar organizations. One could list LifeRing, I suppose, Save Our Sobriety, a couple of others, self-empowering, pro-best practices, pro-medication assisted treatment efforts. And those are just the two big bills. So there's a lot of other stuff going on too.
Yeah. Stick with those bills for a second. Now, what would you say would be the highlights? I mean, I know that you're talking about substance use disorders and the kinds of support groups or support networks, but where do you think the basic fundamental need is that these pieces of legislation are trying to address? What are those core issues that this is trying to address?
The addiction epidemic, and particularly the opioid epidemic, keeps getting worse. The author of the nonfiction book Dope Sick, which was the basis for the somewhat fictionalized Hulu series Dope Sick, she did an article for Atlantic or Harper's, one of those publications, early in the COVID-19 pandemic, saying, don't forget the other one. And the addiction epidemic, the substance use pandemic, and mental health problems all over the place. Mental health problems have gotten worse, particularly for teenagers and young people. The smart meetings I facilitate and that others facilitate who are on the board of Smart Recovery or coordinators or facilitators know, there's more alcohol abuse, more substance abuse, more overdose deaths, more suicides, more deaths of despair than there ever was. The pandemic hasn't helped, but the underlying economic conditions causing the deaths of despair, those numbers would have gone up regardless. They're going up higher, and they've gone up higher. And one of the things unrelated to more wider availability of Suboxone and wider availability of Narcan and more educational programs is the rollout of a 3-digit number suicide hotline, which is going to be not just for suicide, but for mental health generally, which is 988, coming in mid-July to a phone near you.
Okay.
And that way, when there's a crisis, people aren't tempted to only call 911, because if there's a mental health disorder or someone acting out, police action may not be appropriate.
Just something simple like that. It's not just a matter of shortening the number. It's the fact that it'll then be routed to more appropriate help, more appropriate care. And that's, that's a significant thing. I did not know about that, so I'm glad to hear that. Let's back up for a second and tell me what you would say to those who really don't see a need for these kinds of resources for substance use disorders. I mean, we have the epidemic, we have all the statistics, but there are many who don't necessarily see it as the role of the federal government, I imagine. What would you say to those who aren't convinced that the bills you're mentioning and the kind of resources you're alluding to are necessary?
There is a view that the government has a role in partnership with other aspects of our society to provide that. There is a countervailing view that you've expressed in the United States that's stronger than in every other industrialized country, that basically says nothing government does is efficient, and therefore government should do as little as possible. I don't think the number of people that think the federal government should not be involved has more than a handful of seats in Congress. But there are those that think that the federal government's role should be minimal and as a backstop perhaps to other levels of government and churches and community centers and that sort of thing.
I was just going to say, well, even as you mentioned the vote and the overwhelming support, and at least by the vote, but it's only a fraction of what's needed financially. How can we? I'll include myself in this as someone who would see the benefit of more money going to substance use disorder and addiction treatment. What can we do to convince others that this is really something that needs, that maybe, can save money in the long run, or at least be a wise investment? What can we tell people about that?
I think though, there's a lot of people who are led to believe that taxes may go up and it will affect working class people or people except, the very, very, very wealthy. And that's simply not accurate. I suppose if you stop Bernie Sanders at a 7-Eleven and ask them, he might say, yes, everyone should pay more, but he has one vote. I think that, and I think people will want money to be spent for things of importance, but perhaps not want to pay for it and may jump to the conclusion that they may have to pay for it. I've asked this question of key people in Congress. Why doesn't Speaker Pelosi get that bill adopted so that people in states where they have a lot of these tax concerns, like Ohio, for example, but a serious opioid epidemic problem, West Virginia can say
at the same time,
same time, where they can say, gee, Congressman Tim Ryan in Ohio, for example, he's for a bill that will help my sister Sally with her opioid addiction. J.D. Vance isn't, but Sister Sally will. And I'm not sure why they're not pushing that, but I think $150 billion might be a bridge too far. But this kind of bill, more modest bill that passed, even if it were higher, because I think the funding bill is going to have higher funding levels in it, and they'll have to compromise that out. I wouldn't raise the issue unless you hear an objection. If someone comes to you and says, this drug problem is not that serious. It's like the war in Ukraine. It doesn't affect me. Then maybe you can get into a conversation of the importance with them. But I think most people see the need for these issues being addressed, but just don't want taxes to be increased, particularly in a time of economic struggle like we have now, to pay for it.
Right. So a recognition is step one, that there is a problem and that something needs to be done about it. Doesn't there need to be something else about, believing that we can do something about it, believing that things do work? And maybe this is a good segue into things around harm reduction strategies and harm reduction kinds of pursuit. Is there stuff going on in Washington that's addressing this idea of harm reduction? And tell folks what exactly is involved with harm reduction.
Well, that means if you have opioid use disorder, whether it's Oxycontin or heroin or fentanyl or those kind of drugs, and the medication of first defense to stabilize you and to help you recover is Suboxone is the brand name. Well, Smart Recovery evolves as science evolves. Therefore, Smart Recovery supports medication-assisted treatment such as Suboxone, or for that matter, antabuse for people with alcohol use disorder, or Wellbutrin for people with anxiety or depression, whatever that medication is for. And meeting people where they are really means if someone comes to a SMART meeting and says, I don't want to drink on the job, but I have a cannabis card and I reserve the right to use either marijuana cigarettes or cannabis from a dispensary on weekends, that's consistent with, and we don't shame them, we don't criticize them, we allow them to come to the meetings, we welcome them. We may, in the back of our minds, hope they morph into a broader interest in not doing anything maladaptive or addictive because it may adversely affect our lives, but it's not for us to articulate that.
Right.
Maybe a little hope that we have. Well, that's harm reduction,
Well, that's what came up. I think that came up with some of the NIDA research that talked about, I think Dr. Nora Volkoff talked about if someone had been using opioids and then was only using alcohol, that was reduced harm. That was
Yes.
reduced harm, and seeing it in the context of, as you say, we all have our own, self-will, and we're self-directed, and SMART helps us look at it in a self-empowerment modality. And that's what you're talking about. It's got to come from the self.
Yes, well, definitely comes from the self. But what Nora said initially, um, um, we shouldn't exaggerate what she said, but we should be hopeful that it's the first baby step toward a broader, more progressive comment. One of the leading harm reduction advocates, who's a journalist, said to me over lunch a few weeks ago, she thinks Nora, before she retires in a few years, might like expand her views. But what she said was, when you do an intake in treatment, if someone comes to you and all they want to do, they want to stop using heroin or OxyContin, but they do not want to sign a form saying they swear off cigarettes or alcohol or marijuana or what have you, don't deny them treatment. Take them in. That's all she said. But a broader approach is, and Tom Horvath's book from the 80s, one of our longtime presidents and founding board members, who's still on our board as well, his view, not only as a board member, but also with the treatment center he runs in the San Diego area, La Jolla, California, is help people overcome those things that are problematic in their lives. Addiction is not overuse of a substance. Addiction, maybe not the first definition, but the definition that's relevant for providing treatment to people and care for people and support for people, is doing something over and over again despite having negative consequences on one's life.
Right.
And if SMART recovery meetings is a forum for people to articulate how they want to change so they no longer do that which is negative on their life, while they continue to have a drink on New Year's Eve, for example, or what have you, or a drink when they go out, when they cook dinner at home with, a prime rib or very fancy meals. That's consistent with harm reduction. It's consistent with best practices, and it allows us to provide care and support in SMART meetings, and allows clinicians and therapists to provide treatment without forcing them to make some absolutist comment. Yes, our conference this fall, the promotional piece, when you see it in the title, I can find the title talks about new paradigms, and that means multiple paths for mutual aid. It means medication-assisted treatment. It means harm reduction. And in some contexts, particularly the changes in the state laws on marijuana, it means partial decriminalization. Mm-hmm. All of that is on the front burner. And because SMART evolves as science evolves, because SMART embraces best practices, it would be inconsistent for us not to be open and supportive of people, whatever their journey is.
Yeah, meeting them where they are. That's a great point. Let's tell listeners a little bit more about the conference. Where is it, and what kinds of things could people expect to attend the conference?
The conference will be available live stream, like our last several conferences have. If you register, the physical location, with the pandemic either easing or everyone declaring it to have eased one way or another, normal life is returning, or at least the new normal. The location will be the same as last year and the year before. The DoubleTree by Hilton, which is a very nice venue. People shouldn't be thrown off by the DoubleTree brand. It's more like a typical Hilton than a DoubleTree. Okay. So the people that own that property should be impressed. It's in Laurel, Maryland, which is about 5 miles outside of Washington, D.C., very convenient to all 3 airports that serve D.C., and a short drive for people driving from Virginia, Pennsylvania, Maryland, D.C., Delaware, even New York. And
don't forget the train. Don't forget the train. People can take the Amtrak.
Right. If they want
And
to
what's
take the
the
train with President Biden from Delaware, they absolutely.
very good. What's the date on that conference? And I know that folks can get more information at smartrecovery.org about the conference, but mention the date just so people have it in mind.
Saturday, October 22nd, all day. And clinicians who attend at the clinicians rate will get 6 CEUs. So there'll be 6 hours of educational programming. It won't be like your bad 8th grade teacher educational programming. It'll be enjoyable programming that will count as educational credit. And they're the harder to obtain level of CEUs for people with LCPC designations and counseling designations. It's category A, and it's the equivalent whether you're a social worker or a therapist of another kind. The people who come as guests of our sponsors will not have to pay that additional fee. The sponsorship will cover not only an exhibit table and promotional material from the sponsor, but also clinicians who work for that sponsor who are designated to come for free. People will be able to attend who are not in need of the CEUs. That is, someone like me, an attorney. The DC Bar doesn't award CEUs for this conference, so the fee I will pay is a fraction of what the clinicians will be paying. But at the same time, for clinicians that are listening to this, the fees that we assess for our conference is literally a fraction of what the training firms charge for 6 credits. I've paid maybe 3 times what our rate is to sit next to therapists and learn the same material.
And it sounds like an excellent conference to attend, and it's been going on, and now this is a new year, and like you said, it's kind of the new normal. So there'll be some in-person attendees as well as virtual, and people can find out more information about that from smartrecovery.org, and you'll see a registration form, and you'll be able to find it on our website. So let's go back to harm reduction and maybe a role that legislators may play in supporting different kinds of harm reduction. I know there's fentanyl test strips, for instance, or even injection centers. I mean, is this something that the government is seeking support or to support?
The current administration is the first one, and it's really career people. It's people that have been appointed to key positions who have science backgrounds. Then you'd have SAMHSA, the new HHS secretary, the new head of an acronym division within SAMHSA that covers drug abuse and drug addiction issues, particularly the acronym is CSAT. The new drug czar, the first medical doctor to ever be the drug czar in the White House, the Office of DCP is the acronym. Drug czar is what you and I call it.
Okay.
A physician from West Virginia. President Biden personally, for whatever reason, are all strongly in favor of best practices, which means harm reduction. And the COVID relief bill that was passed about a month after he took office, the American Rescue Plan, has a provision in it that I was involved as an outsider, but a former congressional staff person drafting, that Congresswoman Annie Custer of New Hampshire deserves the credit for, and her staff worked very hard on that. She's very on top of the substance use issue coming from New Hampshire, where it's a big problem. And there was a $30 million harm reduction program in the American Rescue Plan. Winners of those grants, I think they've been announced, but I haven't seen the list, but the applications were involving helping people, meeting people where they are. And I'm not sure if it would have included clean using sites, because there's some been pushback from the minority party about that it was a big Fox News story, and there may have been some follow-up legislation to restrict the breadth of the options. But harm reduction is clearly on the agenda now for the first time ever, and it's probably an accident of history. I mean, if I'm trying to think, if John Kasich or Jeb Bush became president, they probably would have done the same thing, because they rely on scientists, But clearly, the group of scientists that are working on this issue in Washington now are very much into that.
Yeah, and I love how you were talking about smart. As science evolves, smart evolves. And that is just so much of what we're talking about with medication assisted treatment, other kinds of things that are coming out. I mean, that's just it makes common sense, really, if you think about it, that it can't be your father's Oldsmobile, as they used to say. It has to be what's going on today. And at the same time that I say that, it's also mutual support has been around for a long time, but it still is a best practice. Would you consider mutual support kind of just the one person talking to another or group of people talking to be a valid kind of way to approach working on substance use disorders?
The SAMHSA administrator in 2017, 18, 19, and 20, in a preface to the then Surgeon General's report, who's I think he's now at Purdue. He was health commissioner in Indiana before he went to Washington. I think he's at Purdue now. His report on the opioid epidemic, the preface by the former SAMHSA administrator, said that, to translate it a little bit, the gold standard for treating people with substance use disorder is medication when appropriate and properly prescribed, Suboxone for opioid use disorder, clearly, or the equivalent, naltrexone. There's other drugs, but Suboxone's the most famous. Therapy from licensed professionals, and interaction with peers that support one and two, that support those other two things. And there are licensed peer recovery specialists around the country under state law that could do one-on-one work. There's patient advocates at treatment centers that are lay people, former patients, that say, well, no, that caseworker doesn't know what she's talking about, but that caseworker does, and whatever. If you need help with housing, here's how you get housing. And then there's the mutual aid groups like Smart Recovery, LifeBring, even a lot of the 12-step meetings, depending on the predilection of the 12-step group and the person that runs that meeting. The 12-step movement is very bottom up, so no one meeting is the same. Smart meetings are subject to a certain set of principles, such as support for MAT, support for best practices. But the 12-step movement's been around so long that people interested in those meetings can search out ones that are most conducive to what their state of mind is.
David,
but yes, the mutual aid meeting is an important part.
Right, that part of the gold standard, and that's very, very well put. So before we wrap up, is there something that we haven't covered about legislation or the kinds of things happening in Washington that you'd like to share?
I just encourage people to look at smartrecovery.org for the information about the conference, and to reach out, and this is an election year, even to vote, and maybe to do more than just vote, depending on their time and their inclination, for congressional and Senate candidates and gubernatorial candidates that rely on science, rely on best practices, and want to help people in need.
Yeah. That's David. I'm sorry?
I think everything else sort of follows from there.
It sure does. And like you say, if someone has the time or the inclination, there's other ways to get involved, but certainly voting is a key way to have your voice be heard. Not to make it too much of a cliche, but it's true. We've been talking with David Koss. He's a Smart Recovery board member and the Director of Government Relations. David, thanks so much for making a time for conversation.
Thank you.
Until next time, this is Luke Frazier. Stay healthy and stay connected.